What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of At a Glance, the series in which I give you an appetizer sampler's glimpse into a particular faction in 40k, and the goal behind it is to help you decide if you want to look further into that force on your own, or maybe even start collecting that force as well. So up on the chopping block by viewer request is the Knights of Blood Space Marine chapter. And when I say Knights of Blood, I'm referring to the Blood Angel Successor chapter. I say that because there is a Knights of Blood Chaos Warband out there. Look completely different, no relation in the fluff at all to the Knights of Blood Successor chapter of the Blood Angels, but same exact name, so it could be a bit confusing, but treat them as two separate entities. It's actually a pretty rare occurrence in 40k that you have two different forces with the same name, and this just happens to be one of those times. With that said, I want to quickly make mention of the Blood Knights, which are a Loyalist Space Marine chapter. Different name, different color scheme, but the only time we see them in terms of a color scheme for the Blood Knights is in the Successor chapter booklet of the Space Marine Special Edition Codex. In their part of that bundle for the Special Edition Codices was a Successor chapter art booklet. In there is the Blood Knights, and the Blood Knights color scheme is different completely from the Knights of Blood. However, as with several chapters, the Blood Knights are shown an alternate shoulder pad, and the alternate shoulder pad shown is a Knights of Blood shoulder pad with their symbol on it. So you're seeing the Blood Knights, which have a different symbol, and then a alternate shoulder pad with the Knights of Blood symbol on it, which was just a little bit confusing. It was something odd I noticed when I first looked through that art booklet. From what I can tell fluff-wise, they're not related at all either, so it's just probably an error on their part that slipped through the cracks. So, with that said, we're not looking at the Blood Knights, we're not looking at the Knights of Blood Chaos Warband, but I'm going to be rambling about the Knights of Blood Space Marine chapter that is a successor to the Blood Angels. So one of the big unique things about this successor to the Blood Angels is that they are a Renegade chapter. They have been excommunicated by the High Lords of Terror because of their actions. And their actions are what you would expect for a Blood Angels successor: wanton aggression, berserk fury, ridiculous carnage, and savagery, not just on the enemy, but also on the Imperial allies that get caught up in it. And like the Flesh Terrors, the Knights of Blood have this problem, only the Knights of Blood actually have the problem worse, and thus were excommunicated. Now this chapter is thought to be a newer chapter of Space Marines, a younger chapter, a later founding. And this is thought that because the way the flaws afflict this chapter is different from how it afflicts older Blood Angel Successor chapters or the Blood Angels themselves. When you read Blood Angel novels and they describe the red thirst or the black rage and how they're trying to fight against it, especially during the heat of battle, it's kind of described as this overwhelming feeling boiling up inside of them like a rising tide that's threatening to overflow and burst forth and engulf them. And they can suppress it, and through force of will and strength of will they can overcome it. And that's kind of how it's described when you read about the red thirst and the black rage in the Blood Angels, for example. The way the Gene Seeds Flaw kind of erupt in the younger successors, the later founding Blood Angel successor chapters, is like a light switch. It just erupts out of nowhere. In the blink of an eye, they're just overcome with this berserk fury, insanity, basically. So, a lot harder to fight against it, and takes hold a lot quicker. And this is how the Knights of Blood experience the Flaw, and this is why they have such crazy savagery in battle, not just against the enemy, but against any allies that stray too close. And this has led to the Knights of Blood fighting on their own, basically keeping distance from any Imperial allies in the field of battle so they don't have that happen. But it still has, it does, and it did, I should say, because they were excommunicated by request of the Inquisition, and the High Lords of Terror excommunicated them. So, now they're a Renegade chapter. And it's important to note, Renegade does not mean Chaos chapter or against the Imperium. Because the Knights of Blood are still loyal to the Emperor. They still view themselves as loyal. And they still fight for the Emperor. They still fight against the enemies of mankind, essentially. They still will come to the aid of beleaguered worlds and attack the enemies in their places of strength. But they do so in a bit more of an isolationist pattern, of course, and they basically relegate themselves to obscurity when they do so, because they cannot come into like more core-word worlds, for example. They have to help more on the fringe and do what they can unsupported in kind of, back alley type of sectors of space, because they are a renegade chapter. They are excommunicated, so the Imperial forces will not take kindly to their showing up. They never did, and they definitely won't now. So they come to the aid out of nowhere, aid unlooked for. They show up, they do their thing, and they leave before Imperial forces can kind of come to their senses and go, hey, wait a minute, those were those guys or whatever. So, as such, they're a bit more of a depleted number chapter, because they have that flaw, which makes for high attrition, you could say, battle. Not attrition, but a high aggressiveness in their assault tactics, or tactics. Basically assault it aggressively. That's the tactic. So that leads to higher loss rates. They have the flaw, which doesn't help that, and they are excommunicated, so they don't have the support of the Imperium at large behind them. So it's harder to recoup your losses in that position. So they are a depleted numbers chapter, but they still fight on as a fighting force. So that's the Knights of Blood. I find them pretty interesting because through it all, even though they have this berserk fury, insanity state of being when they're in battle, they have an overwhelming need to rip the enemy apart in close combat with their bare hands and teeth if necessary. They're still Space Marines, and they aren't dumb. They aren't doing simpleton tactics. They just have a preference and overwhelming need and desire to do something, and they will commit their entire Space Marine physiology, arsenal, and tactics to do so, which means they excel at what they do. Having the Blood Angels lineage definitely helps them with that assault roll, and is the reason why they do have this assault roll. So through that all, they haven't sought the easy way out to just give themselves over to Khorne or whatever to help themselves out. They stay loyal to the Imperium. They still fight against the enemies of mankind, knowing that they are alone and unsupported. The Imperium does not have their back. In fact, the Imperium, if they stray too close to certain forces, will try to apprehend them and take them out. So through it all, they still feel loyalty to the Emperor and pursue the enemies of the Imperium. And that's pretty cool. So combat doctrine-wise, the Knights of Blood are very much a Blood Angel style of chapter. That's who they are successors of, so they definitely have a preference to the assault. But because they have this insane berserk fury mentality in battle, essentially, everything's given over to the assault roll. They may have the equipment to do heavy firepower, but they hardly ever use it. And a lot of their numbers are dedicated to the assault roll. So there's probably little, if any, Devastator squads, and if they are, they probably have shorter range weaponry. And tactical squads probably are given over to an assault roll anyway, so, flamer, melt the weaponry again. And that way they can get close to the enemy and rip them apart. So that's very much their style of play. So that is kind of where you have to look at your play style and see, does it link up. You may like their fluff, you may like their color scheme, which I'll get to in a moment, but if your play style doesn't link up with this, you're not going to have the true quote-unquote Knights of Blood experience, right? So that's their combat doctrine, and their chapter has been restructured due to depleted numbers and whatnot to really reflect the assault role. They're basically your assaulting line breakers, essentially. And being the Knights of Blood, they actually have a pretty knight-like color scheme. So if you were going to associate certain colors with Blood Angels and their successors, the Knights of Blood have a little bit more of that than the Lamenters do. You probably wouldn't have associated yellow necessarily with the Blood Angels. So the Lamenters still have kind of the most unique one there. But the Knights of Blood don't have as much of the associated colors as you would expect either. In fact, they're predominantly silver colored or iron colored. In fact, when it comes to the Knights of Blood, only their helmet, chest emblem, shoulder pads, and the center of their backpack is red. Everything else is silver. Now, their knee pads are a point of conjecture for me because I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. Their left knee pad is red, and their right knee pad is yellow, but I don't know if that changes depending upon company or battle group or whatever the case may be. So do with that what you will. I've only ever seen it with the red and the yellow knee pad. So that's just a minor thing to bring up. But their colors are red for the shoulder pads, red for the chest emblem, red for the helmet, and red for the center of the backpack. Everything else is an iron or silver type of color. Their symbol is a white shield with a red blood drop on it with crossed swords underneath it. It's a cool symbol, very knightly, going along with the silver irony color of their armor, also being kind of knightly-esque as well. That symbol will be a bit difficult to do freehand or otherwise, but if you do some digging online, you can find some stuff for that. Their squad markings and all that is basically exactly the same like the Blood Angels. So they use the blood drop symbols for that, and they do the same exact thing as the Blood Angels do. So that's pretty helpful because those symbols exist, right, on decal sheets and whatnot. So you can make use of that, no problem. So that's their color scheme. I like it. It's different from the other Blood Angel successors, which are mostly red and black, and makes them stand out. And it also fits with their name, Knights of Blood. They got the blood going on and the knightliness going on. So that's pretty cool. With that said, even though they are Renegade and all that, I think the best codex to make use for them is still the Blood Angels codex. They have the Flaw. They have the gene seed of the Blood Angels, so all the special rules and stuff for the Flaw and otherwise that different squads and whatnot may have, and formations and all that jazz will work for the Knights of Blood. So that definitely would work. What's interesting is there is no direct mention to Death Company with the Knights of Blood. You would have to imagine they have some, but I've never really seen any real direct mention to any Death Company or standing Death Company for this chapter. So I don't know if it's the case that they're so heavily afflicted that it might be sometimes hard to tell who has succumbed to the Black Rage utterly as a Death Company member and who hasn't, or if it's just kind of glossed over because we don't have too much written on for the Knights of Blood. I just wanted to bring that up because that would be kind of up to you what you want to do that way. I would imagine if they do have a Death Company, it's maintaining the same color scheme as traditional Death Company, which is black with red. So that's what I would imagine for them. With that aside, just build a heavily aggressive list out of the Blood Angels Codex, and you'll have a pretty cool army list for the Knights of Blood. I would say accounts as Dante doesn't really fit with this chapter. Accounts as Gabriel Seth does, if you want to run a Lord of War that way, or you could just do a generic HQ or accounts as special character HQ, no problem. So, with that said, when it comes to collecting them model-wise, all of the generic bits and kits from GW and Forge World for Space Marines are going to work just fine. The Blood Angel specific kits, as long as you don't utilize anything that's Blood Angel specific in terms of symbols, you'll be fine. Because they utilize blood drops to mark things, any sculpted shoulder pads that just have blood drops on them will be very usable for the Knights of Blood as well. Plus, other stuff that just gives off more of a Blood Angel-y successor vibe if you're going to use the sculpted detail stuff in the Blood Angel kits. Just as long as the Blood Angel symbol is not on their armor, you'll be good to go. And that aside, that's really it for collecting them. It's pretty straightforward. Collecting Space Marines of any variety is pretty straightforward. Generic bits and kits, no problem. And then from there, little specifics depending upon the chapter. So with that said, that's really it for the Knights of Blood Space Marine chapter. A chapter that's itself holds true to its loyalties to the Emperor, but is officially a Renegade chapter that's been excommunicated. So if you really want a hyper-aggressive Berserk Fury type of chapter that maintains loyalty to the Emperor in their own right, but in this case is Renegade, if you like that kind of status that the chapter has and you like the way that they fight, then this is probably going to be the chapter for you. So give them a look-see. There's not too much else written in them, unfortunately. With the timeline frozen like it is, who knows what's going to happen fluff-wise in the future, but I'm hoping once we do more fluff with Blood Angel stuff and the end times and all that in the 40k timeline, we'll get more written on them. Anyways, that's it. Thanks for sticking through it. Any questions, comments, or requests, you can leave it in the comment section. And until next time, take it easy.